Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from, and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. There are places in Middle-earth where the very stones remember blood, where the earth itself holds fast to sorrows that should have faded with the turning of the ages. In the shadowed lands east of the Eamon Mule, where mist clings to brackish waters like the breath of the long dead, there lies a realm that exists between memory and nightmare. A place where the boundaries between what was, what is, and what refuses to die have become as murky as the waters that stretch endlessly beneath grey skies. Here, in the Dead Marshes, where phantom lights dance over stagnant pools and the air tastes of endings, two hobbits once walked in terror through a landscape that defied the natural order of things. Their guide, a creature twisted by centuries of darkness, led them through paths known only to those who had already surrendered their souls to shadow. And as they walked, something beneath the water watched them with eyes that had not closed since the second age of the world. The mist here moves differently than it does in wholesome lands. It coils and writhers with purpose, revealing glimpses of horrors that should not be, concealing truths that are too terrible to face in full daylight. When Frodo Baggins first looked down into those dark waters, he saw something that made his ring-bearer's heart stumble with recognition. Faces, pale and luminous, staring up from depths that seemed to have no bottom. Kings and warriors, elves whose beauty had not dimmed despite their deathly pallor. Men whose noble features spoke of courage that had not saved them from their fate. They lay beneath the surface like sleepers who dream of battles that ended long ago, their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths shaped around words that would never be spoken. Some reached upward with hands that grasped at nothing, as if even in death they sought to climb from the waters that had claimed them. Others seemed to be sinking still, their forms growing dimmer as they descended into darkness beyond the reach of any earthly light. The silence was complete, absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of a natural marsh, but the suffocating stillness of a place where sound itself had drowned. No insects buzzed, no birds called, no wind stirred the sedges that grew in twisted patterns along the banks. Even the water moved without murmur, its surface rippling with the passage of things that cast no reflection, disturbed by currents that followed no earthly law. Yet in that silence, those who listened carefully could hear something else. A whisper so faint it might have been imagination, so persistent it could not be ignored. It was the sound of memory given voice, of sorrows that refused to be forgotten, of names being spoken by lips that had long since turned to dust. The very air seemed thick with unfinished business, heavy with the weight of deeds undone and words unspoken. When the phantom lights began to dance, those flickering candles that appeared without warning above the waters, they revealed glimpses of what lay beneath, in glimpses too brief for comfort, too clear for doubt. Here a crown still circled a noble brow. There a sword remained gripped in a hand that had not relaxed its hold through all the centuries of its owner's strange sleep. Standards and banners floated in the depths like underwater flowers, their colors still vivid despite the darkness that had claimed them. But the most terrible sight of all was the recognition in those upturned faces. The knowledge that though they lay beneath the water, they were not truly dead. Something in their eyes spoke of awareness, of consciousness trapped in forms that could neither live nor properly die. They were prisoners of their own final moments, doomed to replay eternally the last seconds of their lives, forever reaching for weapons they would never grasp, forever falling in battles that would never end. For these were not the bodies of orcs alone, but kings, elves, and men, forever bound by a curse none remember. The ground that would become the Dead Marshes had not always known such horrors. Once, in the glory days of the Second Age, when hope still burned bright in the hearts of the free peoples, this had been a field of valor, where the greatest alliance in the history of Middle Earth had made its stand against the darkness. The Battle of Dagorlad, a name that in the tongues of men means battle plain, had raged across these lands like a storm of steel and fire, shaking the very foundations of the world with its fury. Here had stood Jill, Galad the Elven, king, tallest and most noble of the Noldor who remained in Middle Earth, his spear Eglos gleaming like a star in his hand, as he led the armies of Lindon against the hosts of Shadow. Beside him rode Elendil the Tall, greatest of the Nent men, Rian lords, his sword Narsil singing as it clove through the ranks of orcs and trolls that poured forth from the black gate like a tide of malice given form. The armies that met upon that plain were such as the world had never seen before and would never see again. From every free realm they came. Elves whose beauty was terrible in battle, their mail gleaming like water under starlight, their voices raised in songs that made their enemies weep with despair. Men of Gondor and Arna, the proud remnants of Nen Menna, who remembered the glory of the blessed Isle and fought to preserve its legacy in the lands of their exile. Dwarves from the great mansions beneath the mountains, their axes hungry for orc blood, their beards braided with rings of gold won in battles against the creatures of the deep places. Against them came the might of Mordor unleashed. Orcs beyond counting, their black armor drinking the light of sun and stars, their weapons forged in the fires of Mount Doom. Trolls strode among them like moving hills of muscle and bone, their clubs crushing all before them, their roars drowning out even the screams of the dying. Nazgûl circled overhead on fell beasts, whose cries froze the blood of mortal men, while their master's will drove his servants forward in waves that seemed endless as the sea. For 7 years the siege of Barad-dûr had continued. 7 years of blood and loss, and slow grinding warfare that tested the resolve of even the mightiest hearts. But it was here, on the field of Dagorlad, that the issue would be decided. Here that the Second Age would end in either triumph or catastrophe beyond imagining. The battle raged from dawn to dusk, from season to season, neither side able to claim decisive victory. The very earth groaned under the weight of so much death, the soil growing sodden not with rain, but with the blood of heroes and villains alike. Swords shattered against armor that had been blessed by powers of light and darkness. Shields split beneath the weight of blows that could have felled mountains. And still the fighting continued with a fury that seemed to draw its strength from realms beyond the circles of the world. In the end, it was not strategy or superior numbers that won the day, but the simple courage of those who refused to yield when all hope seemed lost. When Gil, Galad and Elendil at last stood before the gates of Barad-dûr itself, when they faced Sauron in his full might and majesty, they did not flinch from the fire of his presence. They fell, both of them, beneath his hand. But in their falling, they brought him down with them, and the sword Narsil, broken in that final confrontation, still had strength enough to cut the ring from the Dark Lord's hand. Victory belonged to the alliance of men and elves. But it was a victory bought with such a price that even the songs of triumph were shadowed with mourning. The field of Dagorlad was carpeted with the dead. Not just orcs and trolls, but the flower of elvish nobility and the best of mortal men, kings who had ruled wisely, warriors who had fought bravely, young soldiers who had never seen their homes again. All lay mingled together in the democracy of death, their blood soaking into earth that would never again know peace. It should have ended there. The dead should have been buried with honor, their names inscribed in the memory of their peoples, their sacrifice remembered in song and story until the end of days. The field should have been cleansed, blessed by priests and wise women, allowed to heal and grow green again under the healing touch of sun and rain. But Morgoth's corruption had seeped too deeply into the very substance of Arda during the long ages of his dominion. The malice he had poured into the matter of creation could not be simply cleansed away. It lingered in the stones and soil, in the water and air, waiting for moments of great violence and sorrow to manifest itself in forms that mocked the natural order of things. The Battle of Dagorlad, with its unprecedented carnage and the anguish of so many noble hearts breaking at once, provided exactly the catalyst that this dormant evil needed to awaken. As the victorious armies marched away toward their homes, as the carrion birds descended to feast upon the fallen, as the first rains began to wash the blood from the scared earth, something stirred in the depths of the battlefield. Not life, for life was the gift of Eru Ilvatar and could not be twisted to serve the darkness, but a mockery of life, a perversion of the natural cycle of death and renewal that governs all things under the sun. And though the victors marched on to Mordor, the land they left behind began to whisper with the voices of the damned. The corruption that claimed Dagorlad was not the work of Sauron alone, though his defeat had certainly provided the final catalyst for its manifestation. To understand the true nature of what befell that battlefield, one must delve deeper into the fundamental nature of evil in Tolkien's world, into concepts that touch upon the very foundations of creation itself. In the Silmarillion, in notes and letters that the professor would write throughout his life, there emerges a concept that scholars have come to call Morgoth's Ring. The idea that the first Dark Lord, in his jealous rage against the music of creation, had poured so much of his own essence into the matter of Arda that he had become, in a very real sense, part of the world itself. Unlike his servant Sauron, who concentrated his power in a single golden band, Morgoth had made the entire physical realm his ring, corrupting it at the deepest possible level. This corruption was not mere destruction. Destruction can be cleansed, burned away, replaced with new growth. Instead, Morgoth had achieved something far more insidious. He had twisted the very concept of existence itself, introducing discord into the harmonies that held creation together. Where his influence touched, The boundaries between life and death became blurred. The natural cycles of growth and decay were perverted, and the very stones remembered malice as if it were a living thing. In most places, this corruption lay dormant, held in check by the ongoing creative power of Eru and the vigilance of the Valar. But in moments of great violence, when blood was spilled in quantities that staggered the imagination, when noble hearts were broken and courage failed and hope died screaming in the mud, in such moments, the ancient malice could wake and take new forms, feeding on anguish like a parasite feeds on its host. The Battle of Dagorlad had provided a feast beyond anything the dormant corruption could have imagined. Here was not mere slaughter, but the breaking of the greatest alliance ever forged, the death of kings whose lineages reached back to the elder days, the spilling of blood that carried within it the memory of Valinor itself. The very earth drank deep of this anguish, and in drinking, it was changed forever. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. The first rains that fell upon the battlefield did not sink into the soil as rain should, but pooled in depressions that had not existed before, forming stagnant ponds that reflected no light and supported no life. Plants that tried to grow in the blood-soaked earth came up twisted and wrong, their leaves black as old blood, their roots seeking depths that seemed to have no bottom. The bodies of the fallen, which should have decayed according to the natural law, instead began to sink slowly into the softening ground, as if the earth itself were pulling them down into some deeper darkness. But they did not disappear. Through the murky water that began to cover the battlefield, their forms remained visible, preserved in a state that was neither life nor death, but something far more terrible. For the water that rose from the corrupted earth was not mere moisture condensed from clouds, but something that had been distilled from memory itself. The memories of those final moments when heroes fell and kingdoms died, when the greatest hope of the free peoples hung by the thread of a single broken sword. This was water that remembered, that held fast to images and emotions with a tenacity that defied all natural law. As the years passed and the seasons turned, the waters spread beyond the original boundaries of the battlefield, seeping into lands that had never known war, claiming territories that should have been safe from the ancient curse. Trees died as the corrupted moisture reached their roots, their dead trunks standing like monuments to a blight that grew stronger with each passing season. Animals fled the expanding marshes, their instincts warning them away from waters that looked like water but tasted of endings. The few travelers who ventured into the growing wasteland brought back reports that grew stranger and more disturbing with each telling. They spoke of lights that danced above the water without any source, of voices that called out names in languages that had been dead for centuries, of reflections that moved independently of whatever had cast them. Most disturbing of all were the faces, the pale, luminous visages that could be glimpsed beneath the surface of the pools, watching with eyes that held awareness but no hope, for the darkness beneath the water was not absence of life, but life unwilling to die. Those faces that watched from beneath the murky surface were not, as some had supposed, the preserved corpses of the fallen warriors. Death had claimed their flesh as it claims all mortal things, and their bones lay buried deep beneath layers of silt and sorrow. What remained? What stared upward through the phantom waters with eyes that held such terrible recognition? Was something far more complex and infinitely more tragic. In Tolkien's cosmology, each thinking being possesses what the elves call a fda, a spirit or soul that exists independently of the physical form, that carries within it all the memories and experiences and essential nature of the individual. For most mortals, death represents a separation of fda from ha, body, with the spirit departing to whatever fate awaits beyond the circles of the world. But in places where Morgoth's corruption runs deep, where the normal boundaries between states of being have been dissolved by ancient malice, such separations do not always occur as they should. The faces in the Dead Marshes were the eft are of the fallen. Not all of them, but those whose final moments had been so intense, so filled with passion and purpose, and desperate hope, that they had somehow burned themselves into the corrupted matter of the battlefield itself. They were neither truly alive nor properly dead, but trapped in a state between states, doomed to relive their final heartbeats for as long as the marshes endured. Here floated the shade of an elven lord who had died calling upon the name of Elbereth, his last sight the stars he would never see again. There drifted the spirit of a Nantmen, Rian captain whose final thought had been of the white shores of his lost homeland, whose hand still reached for a banner that had burned to ash centuries ago. And there, most terrible of all, hung the phantoms of young soldiers barely out of boyhood, who had fallen in their first battle and now spent eternity trying to understand why their courage had not been enough to save them. They retained enough awareness to know their condition, enough memory to recall what they had been, but they possessed no power to change their fate. The corruption that held them prisoner fed on their anguish, growing stronger with each moment of their suffering, ensuring that their torment would continue until the very foundations of the world cracked apart. Yet they were not malevolent, these trapped spirits. They bore no ill will toward the living who occasionally passed through their realm. If anything, they were filled with a sadness so profound that it seemed to give weight to the very air around them. They mourned not only their own fate, but the fate of all who had fallen with them, all whose sacrifice had purchased a victory that now seemed hollow as a broken cup. Sometimes, when the conditions were right and the barriers between worlds grew thin, a living person might see not just their faces, but their final moments played out like scenes from some cosmic theater. The phantom warriors would rise from their watery graves, their spectral weapons gleaming with cold fire, and reenact the last battle in which they had taken part. They fought with desperate valor against enemies that existed only in memory, their mouths open in battle cries that made no sound, their eyes blazing with determination that had not dimmed despite centuries of defeat. But always, always, the outcome was the same. The phantom enemies proved too numerous, too strong, and one by one the ghostly heroes would fall again, sinking back beneath the waters that had become their eternal prison. And in their eyes, as they descended into the murky depths, was the knowledge that they would rise again tomorrow night, and the night after that, to fight the same hopeless battle until the end of time itself. The corruption of the marshes had given them the cruelest of all possible gifts, perfect memory, coupled with absolute powerlessness. Awareness without agency, the ability to see clearly what they had lost, but no means to reclaim it. They had become living monuments to the truth that not all sacrifices lead to lasting victory, that even the noblest of causes can leave scars that never heal. And sometimes, on nights when the wind falls silent, they still reach for their swords beneath the water. The boundary of the Dead Marshes had never been fixed, never been content to remain within the limits that natural law should have imposed upon it. Year by year, season by season, the corrupted waters spread outward from their original source, claiming new territory with the inexorable patience of a tide that never retreated. What had begun as localized pools on an ancient battlefield gradually became a vast wetland that stretched for leagues in every direction, swallowing roads and settlements, and turning thriving countryside into a wasteland where nothing wholesome could take root. The expansion was not random, not the simple overflow of water seeking its natural level. Instead, it followed patterns that suggested intelligence behind its growth, as if the marshes themselves were a living entity with purposes and hungers of their own. The corruption sought out places where violence had occurred, where blood had been spilled or tears had been shed, drawing strength from any echo of the original tragedy that had given it birth. Ancient burial mounds were among the first new territories to be claimed, their sacred precincts violated by waters that transformed rest into restlessness, peace into perpetual anguish. The honored dead, who should have slept undisturbed until the ending of the world, found themselves drawn into the marshes' collective nightmare. Their individual identities dissolved into the greater tapestry of sorrow that bound all the spirits together. Villages that had stood for centuries found their wells running full with water that tasted of old tears, their fields growing crops that withered on the vine despite abundant rainfall. Wise women and herb masters spoke of a blight that could not be cleansed by any earthly remedy, a sickness that infected not just the body, but the very concept of healing itself. Children born in these afflicted areas came into the world already marked by the marshes' influence, their eyes holding depths that no child's eyes should possess, their dreams haunted by memories that belonged to the long dead. The roads that had once connected the affected regions to the wider world became treacherous beyond description. Travelers who had walked them safely for years found themselves lost within sight of familiar landmarks, led astray by paths that appeared where no paths had been before, guided by lights that promised safety but delivered only deeper darkness. Some few managed to find their way out again, but they returned changed, carrying within them something of the marshes' eternal sorrow that would shadow them for the rest of their days. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the expansion seemed to accelerate in the presence of living beings. Scouts sent to map the growing wasteland reported that the waters rose visibly higher during their brief visits, as if their very presence fed whatever force drove the corruption's spread. The more people who came to study the phenomenon, the faster it grew, until finally the wise rulers of the neighboring lands forbade any further expeditions, hoping to starve the blight of the attention it seemed to crave. Yet even this measure proved insufficient, for the marshes had learned to feed on more than just direct contact with the living. they drank deep of memory itself, drawing sustenance from the mere fact that people in distant lands knew of their existence and spoke of them in whispered conversations by firelight. Every tale told of the Dead Marshes, every warning passed from father to son, every nightmare inspired by stories of the faces beneath the water. All of these became food for the growing corruption, fuel for its expansion into territories that had never seen a drop of the cursed water. Scholars who studied the ancient texts began to find references to similar phenomena in other places and times, suggesting that the Dead Marshes were not unique, but rather part of a larger pattern of corruption that had been spreading through Middle-earth since the elder days. In the ruins of Tol, in Gorhoth, where Sauron had once maintained a tower of werewolves and vampires, travelers reported seeing lights that danced above stagnant pools, faces that peered up from waters that should have supported no reflection. In the paths of the dead, where the oath-breaking men of Dunharrow had been cursed to wander until their crime was atoned, similar manifestations had been observed. Proof that the boundaries between past and present, between memory and reality, had grown dangerously thin throughout the lands that Morgoth's malice had touched. The implications were staggering. If the corruption could spread beyond its point of origin, if it could claim new territory simply by being remembered and feared, then there might be no natural limit to its growth. Given enough time, enough feeding on the sorrows and terrors of the living, it might eventually engulf entire kingdoms, entire continents, transforming the whole of Middle-earth into a vast necropolis where the dead refused to rest and the living found no peace. For the marshes grow not from rain or river, but from memory, and memory never dies. In the deepest parts of the expanding marshes, where the water was black as ink and the mist hung so thick that it seemed solid, there wandered a figure that even the trapped spirits feared to encounter. Gollum, once Smeagol, once a hobbit-like creature who had known simple pleasures and innocent joys, had found in the Dead Marshes a reflection of his own spiritual condition, an external manifestation of the internal corruption that had been eating away at his soul for centuries. The ring had taken him gradually, not in a single moment of surrender, but through countless small compromises, tiny betrayals of his better nature that had accumulated over the years like poison in a well. When he first slipped the golden band onto his finger, when he first felt its power flowing through him like liquid fire, he had told himself that he would use it wisely, that he would remain the master of his new treasure. But the ring served only one master, and it was not the pathetic creature who had murdered for it in the darkness beneath the misty mountains. By the time Gollum emerged from the tunnels where he had hidden for so long, he was no longer truly alive in any sense that the innocent would recognize. The ring had preserved his body while consuming his spirit, leaving him suspended in a state between life and death that echoed the condition of the phantoms trapped beneath the marsh waters. He was a perfect citizen of this nightmare realm, a creature who belonged nowhere else in Middle-earth. The journey through the Dead Marshes should have been torment for any living being, but for Gollum, it was something approaching homecoming. The whispers that drove other travelers to madness were familiar voices to him, speaking in the same tones, as the ring when it called to him in the dark hours before dawn. The lights that led others astray were beacons that guided him along paths he seemed to know by instinct. As if he had walked them countless times in dreams he had forgotten upon waking. When he looked down into the corrupted waters, when he saw the faces of the ancient, dead staring up at him with their terrible awareness, he felt no horror, but rather a kinship that went deeper than blood or species. These were his people now, the lost, the damned. The creatures who had traded everything that mattered for something that had seemed precious at the time, but had proven worthless in the end. The ring on his finger pulsed with sympathetic resonance, recognizing in the marsh spirits a reflection of the fate it had planned for all who dared to claim it. The spirits, in turn, seemed to recognize something familiar in the twisted creature who walked among them without fear. They rose closer to the surface when he passed, their phantom hands reaching upward not in supplication, but in greeting, as if they were welcoming a long, lost brother to their eternal vigil. Sometimes Gollum would pause in his journey to stare down at a particular face, and those who watched from hiding places among the reeds swore they could see his lips moving in conversation with the dead, though no sound carried across the stagnant water. What did they speak of, the corrupted hobbit and the trapped spirits of ancient heroes? Perhaps they shared stories of the choices that had led them to their current state, the moments when they had chosen wrongly and sealed their fates. Perhaps they offered each other the comfort of shared damnation, the knowledge that they were not alone in their suffering. Or perhaps they simply acknowledged each other as fellow victims of powers too great for mortals to resist. Creatures who had been broken on the wheels of cosmic forces they had never truly understood. The marsh lights followed Gollum more closely than they did other travelers, clustering around him like loyal pets eager for their master's attention. But where these phantom flames led others into deeper danger. For Gollum, they illuminated safe passages through the treacherous terrain, showing him hidden paths and stable ground that allowed him to move through the wasteland with surprising speed and efficiency. The marshes that trapped and destroyed others became for him a highway, a means of travel that kept him hidden from the eyes of those who might seek to reclaim the precious thing he carried. Yet even in this realm of the damned, even among spirits who had themselves fallen victim to forces beyond their control, Gollum remained an object of pity and revulsion. The dead might recognize a kinship with him, but they also saw in his current state a warning of what they themselves might become if their suffering continued long enough. He was their future made manifest, not just trapped between life and death, but actively corrupted, transformed into something that violated the natural order more completely than even their own phantom existence. For even in this place, the marshes found a kindred spirit, something alive that had already died. There came at last a moment when the ring's journey brought new travelers to the borders of the Dead Marshes, and with them came a test that would determine whether the ancient corruption had grown strong enough to claim new victims from among the living. Frodo Baggins, bearer of the ring, walked into that nightmare landscape, carrying within himself the very source of its power, the golden band that had once graced the hand of Sauron himself. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ring's presence in the marshes was like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for centuries, like a conductor raising his baton before an orchestra of the damned. Every phantom face beneath the water turned toward the approaching hobbit. Every trapped spirit felt the stirring of something that might have been hope if it had not been so thoroughly poisoned by despair. For Frodo carried more than just the ring. He carried the living flame of resistance to everything the marshes represented. His spirit, though burdened by the weight of his task and shadowed by the growing influence of the Golden Band, still burned with the clean fire of courage and compassion that had been lit in the Shire and kindled to greater brightness by his friendship with Gandalf the Grey. In the midst of this realm of living death, he was an anomaly that the corruption could neither ignore nor easily digest. The faces in the water pressed closer to the surface, their features becoming clearer and more defined as they drew near to the ring's power. But what they saw when they looked upon the hobbit was not the master they had expected, not the Dark Lord returned to claim his realm of shadow. Instead, they saw something that struck them with recognition and longing so intense it made the very water around them begin to glow with phosphorescent light. Here was innocence, not the ignorance of one who had never faced darkness, but the deeper innocence of one who had looked into the abyss and chosen not to let it look back into him. Here was sacrifice freely offered, burden willingly carried, power rejected, even when acceptance would have been the easier path. In Frodo, the dead warriors saw everything they had been before their final battle, everything they had hoped to preserve through their sacrifice, everything that made their current torment meaningful rather than merely cruel. The ring, sensing the profound spiritual resonance between its bearer and the trapped spirits, began to sing with harmonies that had not been heard since the forges of Mount Doom had cooled after its creation. It whispered to Frodo in voices that sounded like the ancient dead, promising him that he could free them, that he had only to reach into the water and take their hands and pull them up into the light once more. All it would cost was a moment's surrender to the ring's will, a single instant of letting his guard down and allowing the Golden Band to work its power through him. The temptation was overwhelming. Frodo had seen enough of war and loss to understand the value of the sacrifice these spirits had made, had felt enough of his own burden to empathize with their endless suffering. When he looked down into the water and saw a young elven warrior whose face held such desperate hope that it made tears start in his eyes, when he saw an Emen lord whose noble features were twisted with anguish that had lasted for 3,000 years, the hobbit's heart broke with the desire to help them. But even as his hand moved toward the water, even as the ring pulsed with eager anticipation of the feast of corruption it would enjoy if he gave in to this compassion, another voice cut through the supernatural chorus of the marshes. Sam Gamgee. Faithful Sam, who had followed his master into darkness and would follow him into the very fires of Mount Doom, if necessary, called out with the clear, uncompromising love of simple friendship.
Mr. Frodo!
The words were like a bell ringing in a cathedral, like the first light of dawn breaking over a battlefield, like the voice of sanity in a world gone mad. They cut through the ring's seductive whispers, through the plaintive calls of the dead, through the terrible compassion that would have doomed both hobbits to join the eternal vigil beneath the waters. They reminded Frodo of who he was, why he had come to this place, what duty he owed to the living that superseded any obligation he might feel toward the dead. The moment passed. The ring's song faded to a sullen whisper. The faces beneath the water sank back into the depths, their features becoming indistinct once more, their hope transforming back into the patient despair that had sustained them through so many centuries of waiting. The marsh lights that had gathered around the hobbits, like moths around a flame, dispersed into the mist, leaving only the familiar phantom glow that served to mark safe passage through the treacherous terrain. But something had changed in that moment of near surrender, something that would echo through the remainder of their journey and beyond. Frodo had seen clearly what the ring wanted to do to him, had felt the pull of corruption that was both stronger and more subtle than simple evil. He had learned that the greatest temptations come not in the form of obvious wickedness, but disguised as mercy, as justice, as the desire to help those who suffer. And had Sam not called his name, Frodo might have joined them. Another face beneath the flame, in the darkest hours of the night, when the mist hung thickest over the stagnant waters, and even the phantom lights seemed dim and far away. Other luminances began to appear above the dead marshes. These were not the steady glows that marked the presence of the trapped spirits, nor the flickering willow, wisps that led travelers astray, but something else entirely. Flames that danced without fuel, candles that burned without wicks, lights that existed in defiance of every natural law, yet somehow seemed more real than the darkness they pierced. The people of the surrounding lands had many names for these phenomena. Some called them corpse candles, believing them to be the souls of the dead made visible through the power of their suffering. Others spoke of ghost lights or death flames, attributing to them all manner of supernatural properties and dire warnings. Scholars who studied such matters from the safety of distant libraries theorized that they might be manifestations of swamp, gas ignited by some unknown catalyst. But those who had actually seen them knew better. These were not mere chemical reactions, but something far more significant and terrible. The truth, as Tolkien's deepest lore suggests, was more complex than any of the popular explanations could encompass. The candles that burned above the dead marshes were indeed connected to the spirits trapped beneath the water, but they were not the souls themselves. Instead, they represented something more fundamental: the visible manifestation of memory itself. The moment when recollection becomes so intense that it takes on independent existence and begins to affect the physical world. Each flame marked a point where one of the phantom warriors was reliving a particularly vivid moment from their final battle, where the force of their remembrance was strong enough to push through the barriers between thought and reality. The light came not from any earthly combustion, but from the burning of pure emotion. Grief and valor and desperate hope condensed into forms that could be perceived by mortal senses. When a trapped spirit remembered the moment when their banner was raised in defiance of overwhelming odds, a tall flame would spring up above the water, its light carrying within it all the pride and determination that had animated that long-ago gesture. When another phantom recalled the face of a loved one seen for the last time as they rode out to war, a gentler glow would appear, soft and golden as candlelight in a window that welcomes the traveler home. But not all the memories that fueled these flames were noble or inspiring. Some burned with the cold fire of despair, marking the moments when hope died and courage failed, when the bravest hearts finally acknowledged that their cause was lost. Others flickered with the heat of rage and hatred, the final fury of warriors who died knowing that their enemies would outlive them to celebrate victory over their corpses. The most terrible flames of all were those that burned with the pale light of regret, the memories of choices unmade, words unspoken, opportunities lost forever in the chaos of battle. These were the candles that drew living travelers most strongly, for they spoke to the universal human experience of looking back on life and seeing all the ways it might have been different, all the paths not taken and chances not seized. For those who possessed the sight to see beyond the surface of things, the pattern of the flames revealed the true scope of the tragedy that had befallen the battlefield. Here was not just the record of a single battle, but a complete chronicle of the war, of the last alliance preserved in light and shadow, written in a language that could be read by anyone who had ever loved something enough to fight for it, ever lost something precious enough to grieve for it, ever faced a choice between safety and duty, and chosen the harder path. The flames moved in response to the presence of living beings, clustering more thickly around travelers, as if seeking to share their burden of memory with those who still had the power to act upon what they remembered. But this sharing was not without cost. Those who looked too long into the corpse candles found their own memories, becoming confused with those of the dead, their personal histories blending with the chronicles of ancient heroes, until they could no longer distinguish between what they had experienced and what they had witnessed in the phantom flames. Some few who had spent extended time in the marshes reported that the candles occasionally formed patterns that seemed almost linguistic in nature, as if the dead were attempting to communicate something beyond their individual memories, some message that could only be expressed through the collective arrangement of their shared pain. But if such communications existed, their meaning remained locked away from mortal understanding, preserved in a code that perhaps only the dead themselves could decipher. Those who follow the lights never return, for they are not lights of hope, but memories begging to be remembered. As the Third Age drew toward its close, and the dominion of men began to replace the fading glory of the elder races, the scholars of Minas, Tirith, and Rivendell found themselves confronting a disturbing truth about the Dead Marshes and the corruption they represented. The evil that festered in those stagnant waters was not, as many had assumed, merely a lingering remnant of Sauron's malice that would fade with his final defeat. Instead, it drew its power from a source far older and more fundamental: the discord that Morgoth had woven into the very fabric of creation during the music before time began. This revelation came through careful study of the oldest texts, the chronicles that predated even the arrival of the Noldor in Middle-earth, the fragmentary records of the Valar themselves, when they still walked openly among the children of Ilúvatar. In these ancient sources, the wise found references to other places where the boundaries between life and death had been similarly corrupted. Other battlefields where the honored dead refused to rest. Other waters that reflected not the sky above, but the memories of those who lay beneath. The pattern was clear to those who had eyes to see it. Wherever great violence had occurred on a sufficient scale, wherever noble hearts had been broken in service of impossible causes, wherever the innocent had died in numbers that staggered the imagination, there the ancient discord could take root and grow, feeding on anguish until it became strong enough to reshape reality according to its own twisted vision. Morgoth's defeat at the end of the First Age had not eliminated this corrupting influence, but merely driven it deeper, forced it to work more subtly and over longer periods of time. Like a poison that lies dormant in the bloodstream until the body's defenses are weakened by illness or injury, the primordial evil waited for moments of catastrophic loss to manifest itself in new and terrible forms. The War of the Last Alliance had provided the perfect opportunity. The combination of unprecedented carnage with the presence of Sauron's own malice had created a resonance that awakened powers that should have remained sleeping until the end of the world. The ring's influence, concentrated in the person of the Dark Lord himself, had served as a focus for forces that were far older than he was, far more fundamental than his personal ambitions for dominion over Middle-earth. Even after Sauron's defeat and the cutting of the ring from his hand, even after his spirit had fled to the ruins of Mount Doom to begin the long process of regeneration, the corruption he had helped to awaken continued to grow and spread. The Dead Marshes expanded not because of any conscious will on his part, but because the ancient discord had found a foothold in the world and was now operating according to its own inexorable logic. This realization carried with it implications that chilled the hearts of even the wisest counselors. If the corruption could manifest independently of its original catalyst, if it could continue to grow and spread, even after the power that had awakened it was destroyed, then there might be no final victory over the darkness, no ultimate triumph of good over evil. Each generation would have to fight the same battle they knew, facing manifestations of the primordial discord that took forms appropriate to their own fears and weaknesses. The Dead Marshes were not an aberration but a preview, a glimpse of what all of Middle-earth might become if the children of Ilúvatar ever ceased their vigilance, ever stopped believing that the light was worth defending against the encroaching shadow. They were a reminder that evil was not merely a force that existed outside of creation, seeking to destroy it from without, but a corruption that had been woven into the very heart of existence and could only be held at bay through constant struggle and eternal watchfulness. Yet even this grim knowledge carried within it a seed of hope. For if the corruption was indeed woven into the fabric of creation, then so too was the capacity to resist it. The music of creation had not been destroyed by Morgoth's discord, but rather made more complex and beautiful by the very presence of the themes he had introduced. Where his malice created death without release, the power of Eru created sacrifice that gave meaning to loss. Where discord brought despair without end, harmony offered sorrow that could be transformed into wisdom. The Dead Marshes would endure as long as Middle Earth itself endured, but they would never be more than they were. A limited corruption held in check by forces greater than itself. They could grow and spread, but only within boundaries that had been set by powers higher than Morgoth himself. They could claim new victims, but only from among those who chose to enter their domain. They could offer false hope and deceptive promises, but they could never truly destroy the genuine article. And as long as memory remains in Middle Earth, so too will the Dead Marshes whisper. In the years that followed the War of the Ring, when Sauron's dominion was finally broken and the Fourth Age of Middle Earth began, the Dead Marshes did not vanish, as some had hoped they would. The defeat of the Dark Lord had indeed weakened the corruption that festered in those stagnant waters, but it had not eliminated it entirely. Like a wound that has healed on the surface, but continues to fester beneath. The marshes remained as a testament to truths that the children of Ilu-Vatar found uncomfortable to acknowledge. The new king of Gondor, a lesser who had once been called Aragorn, looked upon the problem of the Dead Marshes with the weight of hard-won wisdom. He had walked through those nightmare waters himself, had felt the pull of the phantom faces beneath the surface, had seen firsthand how the ancient corruption could twist even noble impulses into instruments of damnation. He understood that some wounds could not be healed by sword or scepter, that some evils were too deeply rooted to be simply cut away. Yet he also understood the deeper truth that the marshes represented. That they were not evil in the way that Sauron had been evil. Not a conscious malevolence seeking to destroy all that was good and beautiful in the world. Instead, they were memory given form. Sorrow made manifest. The price that all mortal races must pay for the gift of caring deeply about things that could be lost. They were the shadow cast by love itself. The inevitable consequence of hearts that chose to risk everything in service of causes greater than themselves. The scholars who studied the marshes in these later days came to understand them as a kind of memorial. Not the deliberate monument that living beings might erect to honor their dead, but something more primal and honest. They were the world's own way of remembering, of ensuring that the sacrifice of the noble dead would not be forgotten, even when their names had passed from all songs and their deeds from all stories. In this light, the faces beneath the water took on a different meaning. They were not prisoners trapped by cosmic injustice, but witnesses whose testimony could never be silenced. Guardians whose vigil would continue until the very foundations of the world were remade. Their suffering was real, and their condition was terrible, but it was not meaningless. They had become living proof that some things were worth dying for, that some causes justified any sacrifice, that heroism existed not in the expectation of reward, but in the willingness to pay whatever price Valar demanded. The new age brought new pilgrims to the borders of the Dead Marshes. Not treasure seekers or the merely curious, but those who sought to understand the true cost of the freedom they now enjoyed. Veterans of the War of the Ring came to stand in silence beside the stagnant waters, their own faces reflecting in the surface that also held the images of the ancient dead. They came not to disturb the phantom's rest, but to acknowledge the debt they owed to those who had fought and died for the same cause in an earlier time. Minstrels and storytellers began to speak of the marshes not as a place of horror to be avoided, but as a shrine where the living could commune with the deepest truths about courage and sacrifice and the price of peace. They sang new songs that honored not just the heroes whose names were known, but the countless unnamed warriors whose faces looked up from the dark water with eyes that held no reproach, only the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. And slowly, gradually, the expansion of the marshes began to slow and finally to halt. Not because the corruption had been defeated, but because it had found its proper place in the order of things. It no longer fed on the fear and revulsion of the living, but on their respect and gratitude. It no longer sought to spread its influence into wholesome lands, but was content to serve as a boundary marker between the world of the living and the realm of memory. The lights that danced above the water still burned, but their flames grew steadier and more constant. Less like the wild flicker of uncontrolled emotion, and more like the eternal flame that burns before the altar of a great cathedral. The faces beneath the surface still watched, but their expressions grew more peaceful with each passing year, as if they had finally found the rest they had sought for so long. Yet the whispers never entirely ceased. On certain nights, when the wind was still and the moon was dark, when the boundaries between past and present grew thin as gossamer, the voices of the ancient dead could still be heard rising from the marshes like the murmur of prayers in a distant chapel. They spoke no words that living ears could understand, but their meaning was clear enough to any heart that had ever loved something more than life itself. They were singing, not the battle, songs they had known in life, not the mourning, songs that had marked their deaths, but something new and strange and infinitely beautiful. They were singing the song of completion, the melody of service fulfilled and duty discharged, the harmony of those who had given everything and found that everything was enough. So when next the wind crosses that haunted plain, listen closely, for what you hear may not be wind, but the sigh of heroes who never left the field. The dead marshes endure as they must endure, as long as memory itself survives in Middle-earth. They stand as proof that some sacrifices echo through eternity, that some loves are stronger than death, that some truths are too important to be allowed to fade into the comfortable forgetfulness that time usually brings. They are terrible and beautiful, tragic and triumphant, a wound in the world that has become its own form of healing. In their stagnant waters, the past and present meet in waters that reflect not what is, but what was and what might have been. In their phantom lights, hope and despair dance together in patterns too complex for mortal understanding. In their whispered voices, the dead speak to the living of truths that can only be learned through loss, wisdom that can only be purchased with sorrow, peace that can only be won through war. They are the heart of the world's memory, the place where Middle-earth keeps its most precious and most painful treasures. They are the proof that love endures beyond death, that courage outlasts the causes it serves, that some things are worth preserving even at the cost of eternal anguish. And in their endless vigil, they remind all who see them that the price of peace is always paid by those who will never live to enjoy it, that the foundations of every golden age are built from the bones of heroes whose names are forgotten. That the light which guides each new generation burns brightest in the places where the darkness is deepest. The dead marshes whisper still and will whisper always, their voices joining the great song that began before time and will continue after time ends. They are the shadow that gives meaning to the light, the sorrow that makes joy precious, the death that gives life its value. They are memory itself, given form and granted eternal watch over the truths that must never be forgotten. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.